even saying we've done this many MQLs isn't really enough anymore. We've got, as marketing, we've got to go further than that and show our true worth.
That was Niall, and this is Social 3.0, the podcast dedicated to helping you drive growth in B2B marketing. In this episode, I sit down with Niall Sullivan, marketing leader at Sensei. Sensei are a Siemens company, and Niall's story is an interesting one, going from a marketing leader in a startup, now post-acquisition working in Siemens. There are 3 key takeaways in this podcast, and this podcast is recommended for anyone looking to grow their career in marketing. 1, we talk about how Niall's developed his marketing strategy on the basis of a podcast. It's a great example of what I'd call a cornerstone content strategy, where the podcast is used to drive growth across other channels. We also talk about how Niall's shifted mindsets around metrics, how he's helped transform how marketing is perceived from a lead generation machine into one that truly is accountable for revenue, which I absolutely love. And also Niall shares some tips related to how others can grow their career in marketing and how they can change perceptions of marketing internally. This is a great one for anyone looking to build their career in marketing. Hope you enjoy. Hey Niall, great to see you, and thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. How are you doing?
Yeah, no, very good, very good. Thank you for the invite, Andy. I'm really pleased to be on here and talking to you today.
Let's talk about content. Let's talk about some of the operating model around your content strategy, because I know quite heavily podcast based. So give us a sense of what's the cornerstone of your content strategy, and all of the content that spins out of that. So give us a sense of your operating model. That'd be really helpful.
Yeah, so there's like a fundamental part of this is really the central part of all this is the podcast, as you mentioned, which we've been running. I think it's about 3 years, October, November time. And actually, when I first started the podcast, it wasn't intended for that. It was intended to be, a great way to chat people, share great content, and that kind of thing. But then there was a few light bulb moments for me, following various influencers on LinkedIn and people really in the known B2B marketing circles, like Chris Walker at Refine Labs, I'll call him, because he effectively changed my career and my mindset. And it was all sort of common sense marketing as well. It's like, of course, people don't want to, people don't really, read ebooks or particularly maybe not read ebooks, but give their information away. And it's how people consume content has changed as well. Because I was a copywriter, I used to love writing blogs and ebooks and all sorts of things, but through someone like Chris Walker and keeping a close eye on the market, I could see that things were changing and the way people consume content is changing. So just wanted to give that background there. But just to clarify, as well, what you're talking about there is like how the shift in people consuming content. You're talking about less people wanting or be willing to accept putting in their email address in exchange for content. So ungating content is something that you're advocating for here, right? I'm a massive advocate for that. And there was a sort of in-between period where I was like, well, maybe we could gate this or that, but really I'm all just for giving it away. And that's based on actually talking to customers as well and talking to prospects. They just want the information they need in easy to consume formats in the places where they consume that content, which is primarily for B2B, obviously LinkedIn, but it could be on your website as well, because people obviously gather information there. So you just need to ungate it and make it easy as possible for them to receive that. But I guess you mentioned challenges before as well. So I guess another challenge is, even if you focus on ebooks and written content, it's very hard to scale that up. Is either you have to outsource it to people to do it for you, or it obviously takes a lot of time to put together internally. So at the time, it was just me and a couple of other people on the team. And one of those I hired in. So I hired in a video editor for this particular purpose. And the idea is that we've got this great podcast we've just been building up steadily, adding more episodes, building up momentum. I'm very fortunate to have a lot of people internally who are really happy to take part. I have people come to me now saying, I want to do this episode with you, which is exactly the place you want to be with a podcast.
So just to clarify, what's the topic of the podcast and how did you define the topic of it?
Yeah, so it's called trend detection, which is I think it's an industry term as well, but it's within our application as well, and it just sort of lent itself, I thought, quite well, to the podcast and sharing trends in the market and all that kind of thing. But the overall topic is, it's predictive maintenance, which is our sort of core topic, but it's predictive maintenance, especially now being part of the Siemens world, that's just one small topic in the bigger picture, because there's digital transformation, there's IoT, and there's lots of stuff. So it might have started off as this predictive maintenance podcast, but I see it as a much broader spectrum, and that's led to lots of new avenues opening up, interviewing lots of external people from lots of different types of companies, maybe not direct, well, maybe related to predictive maintenance, but maybe, but not. There's lots of side shoots off predictive maintenance in terms of topics, which is perfect. Is absolutely perfect. But
got you. So initially it started as a podcast targeted very much at your core demographic. I guess this was pre-acquisition as well, right? So your core demographic focused on this like trend detection or predictive maintenance. But as it's evolved and grown, it started to morph into, broaden out into other topics as well, right? So it's kind of organically grown like that.
Yeah, no, exactly. Because people who are interested in predictive maintenance will be interested in digital transformation and, listening to, other maintenance people or maybe some other technologies related to it as well. So it's, I think that's the thing about a podcast. I sort of get when people want to really niche. I guess that's probably mentioned a lot, is people need to niche down into something, so niche. But I see as predictive maintenance like a starting point. There's all these other topics which connect to it. So, and it also helps that you're not just repeating predictive maintenance all the time. You're sort of varying out for the audience as well, which I think probably helps.
And who's the target? Like CIOs or, it gives a sense of that.
Yeah, so I guess our target personas really is either it's on what we say IT or OT. So it's senior IT people, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. And we have sort of more OT, so more maintenance side, but maintenance people who are interested in technology and how can technology be used to improve their sort of day-to-day workflow and things like that. So they may not be in a technology, and I guess on top of that, it's all because we're sort of an enterprise product as well. It's people within organizations who are responsible for technology and deploying that, globally. So they'll look at Sensei, bring it into their organization, start in one plant, and then hopefully expand to their 20 plants or whatever. Right. So it's that person who can drive that change. So it's mainly sort of IT leading, I'd say now, more so.
Got it. So that's giving me a good sense of like who you're targeting, the reasons for it. It's great to see how it's continued to grow. So there you've got like the core podcast with the target audience, etc. So yeah, give us a sense of how that then fuels the rest of the content engine.
Yeah, so like I said at the start, it was just 3 people. So and there's a basic premise of we record lots of episodes and publish them. We then use my video editor to edit it into small clips, or we outsource it a bit more now, but edit into smaller clips. And then we use, at the time, when we first started before acquisition, we'd use our organic social a bit more, but primarily we use things like paid LinkedIn to guarantee the distribution of content. And then it's just a continuous circle of, putting fuel in the fire with the content. And it's just a continuous loop. And we managed to sort of grow that and scale that with just 3 people. So that's what I'd say to people wanting to follow a similar approach is, you don't need lots of resources and lots of people to achieve this. But what that then allowed us to do, so that was one thing, taking these clips from episodes. But then I think it was about just over a year or so ago, I hired a sort of a content writer or a copywriter, and then she now turns that into sort of blogs, into white papers, into social media posts as well. And actually, there was a UK colleague, who came up with a great term for it, which I'll continue to claim as mine. But it's juicing. It's like juicing the fruit. That's the first reaction when I sort of presented this approach, and that's exactly what it is. And we also use it for other things. There's a lot of talk about turning into ebooks and blogs, but we also turn it into because internal marketing is quite important, in a company the size of Siemens as well. So, but we even use it to. We have an online learning platform, to teach people about Sensei, and we turn some of that content into online courses and things. So, for me, it's the easiest way to scale content production, which from very early in my career was always a challenge, because it was me writing the blogs, me posting on social media, and it was such a challenge having to do that and scale that. New white papers, new blogs, we need them, but using a podcast as your central point is such an effective way to do it. And over time we're now up to sort of 2 episodes a week. It's a
Oh, wow.
it's a very slick machine.
Significant.
And we have so much in the backlog as well. It's amazing. It's almost like I'm almost addicted to recording. So there's always plenty there. But another point actually as well is you don't just need to record new podcast episodes. Look at, webinars is a tool that's been used for years in B2B marketing, but they're just sort of sitting on the website or sitting on YouTube or whatever. Why don't you have a look at those, dust them off, and turn them into a 3-part podcast episode? And that's what we used to do. And at the time, we were just, that was one thing at the start. We were really keen to do 1 episode a week. We're like, how are we going to record 1 new episode a week? And it was like, well, actually, we don't need to do that all of the time, because we could just take this webinar, because it's an hour or whatever, and cut it into 3 episodes. But we don't tend to do that anymore, because we've got so much in the backlog that if we have a 40-minute podcast, we'll just publish it in 1 part generally. But especially when you're just getting things up and running, it's a really useful way, because consistency is, again, what I think that's what ultimately one of the reasons which ultimately leads to failure of any podcast, but B2B podcasts as well, because it's, you do a couple of episodes, oh no, I've missed a couple of weeks, oh no, well, we shouldn't really bother now, so let's stop. And it's a shame, because it's such a great, I'm a big, well, as you can tell, a big believer in it. In its power, and you must be too, because we're here today. So
exactly. Yeah, you're preaching to the choir here now. So what I find particularly interesting though is some of your thoughts around repurposing, taking those webinars, repurposing them as podcasts. Really smart idea. So I know we're speaking more about podcasts and more about podcasts today than we do typically about social. So usually this is more of a social media oriented podcast, but it's really interesting to look at these other organic content types that are performing really well. So I want to double click a little bit more into this podcast piece too. So you mentioned that, it's taken time to scale up, especially to get all of the guests as well, because, outreach and booking guests, etc. So do you have any advice and suggestions for anyone that's looking at starting a podcast and wants to get guests on? Have you kind of cracked any processes around this?
Yeah, I think the honest truth is, in the beginning, I think getting external guests, unless you've got a fantastic network of people in your industry on LinkedIn, or it depends what industry you're in, but if you're a marketer like me in an industry where you're not as connected with experts in the industry, say I was doing a marketing podcast, and it might be easier for me to, because I know a few marketers and I'm connected with a few marketers, so that actually might be better. But so what I would suggest is, and it depends. Actually, I was going to say it depends on the size of the organisation, because he's in with, when Sensei, we're a 50-person company. I was able to call upon, I think the first thing is just to look internally first at people who'd be willing to come on with, because what I describe the podcast particularly is, it's actually taking all the expertise, fantastic expertise within the Sensei team within Siemens, and packaging it up and pushing it out into the world, because these guys know what they're talking about. Very, very intelligent, very talk to customers all the time. They're the perfect people so particularly customer facing people are the perfect people, because they talk to customers every day. They know the problems, they have the anecdotes, they know all this stuff. So you need to identify those people internally. And I guess to start with, it's going, maybe you could even start with just a small number, because I've got lots of recurring guests. So I think what you do is you interview a few different people, then you realize that some guests it just it maybe even flows a bit more natural, whether they're more keen to be on the podcast as well. So if you identify those people, then they won't mind you saying, oh, could you come on and record this again? Can you record, and from there it builds momentum, because other people sort of go, oh, I'd quite like to be on there as well. I've got this topic, and then it sort of builds momentum from there, I guess. And like I said, I get people to a point where people now ask me, I've got this topic, could I come on and do it? And I love that. That's even better for me. I love when people come to me with topics, because they're the people who mostly talk to customers. So I listen to that. I take those, I prioritize them even, I'd say.
Got you. So that makes sense. Basically looking internally first to find those subject matter expertise and elevate that. Also using guests again, repeating that, and maybe covering a different topic. And then eventually it grows podcast gets known internally, it becomes more inbound than outbound. So that's a good starter, because I imagine there'll be more people in the situation that you describe where you're trying to build a podcast for an industry that you're not well known in, because I think that represents typical B2B marketing. Yes, today we're doing a marketing podcast, we're two marketers, just kind of easy and self-explanatory, but not representative of like the reality. So I think your approach of looking internally first, building up the base of that podcast. I'm guessing you have external guests now, like maybe customers and other industry leaders now, or is it mostly internal folk?
Yeah, I'd say especially in recent times, it sort of picked up. The external side's picked up, and that's also important for the podcast as well in terms of reach. Because what we do is with external guests, we'll record an episode and we'll build these sort of mini packs of information. So we'll give them a social media post and maybe a graphic or maybe a video clip or whatever. And we say, look, here you go. Please, can you share it? It's all here. You just need to copy and paste and it just makes it easy. And that approach seems to be effective. But I guess if you are looking for external guests, what I'd suggest is first thinking about, especially if you're a software company, no doubt you'll have partners you work with, and people who sort of work on sort of the fringes of, whether partnerships or delivery partners or implementation partners. I don't know, but those are a really good place to start, because obviously they've already got a relationship with the company one way or the other, and someone within your company can then introduce you and start from there. And most people are quite happy to appear on podcasts because it's showcasing their company as well. So it's that from a purely software sort of standpoint, I'd say that where you have a great partner network, that's like easy pickings in terms of finding external guests, and then just generally asking people internally if they, the people maybe who've been in the industry longer within your teams, do they have any recommendations as well? And I tend to see people on LinkedIn as well, because I'm connected obviously with people within Siemens and Sensei, and then they like someone's post. Oh, that person looks interesting. I'm just going to reach out and see if they want to be on the. And then sometimes you hear back, and sometimes you don't. But a lot of the time I do. And then so I don't necessarily get inbound from external, but what I do, I think one thing you have to do is keep your eyes peeled for opportunities, both in terms of topics. So we have Slack, and I see things being posted. I'm like, oh, can we do a podcast about that? That'd be really interesting. Or that. It's like you've got to be like a journalist. Maybe that's where that comes in, where you're looking for the stories or the topics that are really hot. I'll give an example actually. So you mentioned customers. So it's quite rare to interview customers in our world. For whatever reason, they're incredibly busy people working with big organizations. But now and again, there was an opportunity I saw in our internal Yammer or Viva Engage, it's called, I think now, but where we posted about success, where we'd save the customer like 24 hours of downtime, which is, a lot of money in their world. It could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. But I spotted that, and I just asked on the off chance the customer success person, could I, do you think I could interview the customer about it and just talk to them about it? And he was like, I'll ask. And then within sort of a few days, like us sort of turnaround, similar to us, we were recording the podcast and they were really happy to do it. And I got some great content there. So so that's the other way to avoid that issue of, doing a couple of podcasts and running out of ideas, is just constantly keep your nose to the ground, look for opportunities to record, look for topics, ask people and record it. And then you have this backlog and you don't need to worry as much about, where's the next episode going from? Because it's just there. I don't worry about, we're not going to be able to publish 2 episodes this week, so I know it's already there. But that doesn't mean I take my foot off the brake in terms of recording. So I want to keep the momentum going. That's always in the back of my mind.
Yeah. Got you. Yeah, I definitely feel the challenge of that constant content creation, trying to do a weekly podcast, trying to keep up with that cadence and amongst all the other stuff that's going on. So yeah, I think you give some really sage advice for how to actually create a model around it. And talking of models, it's great to see how that content's being repurposed both into the podcast and out of the podcast through social content. We'll talk more about social content in a second, but I want to pick on a couple of things. You may mention a really interesting point about like internal marketing yourself, talking about the podcast and, inviting people internally to get onto it as a platform. I think just like career developmentally, that feels like a really strong play for marketers, because not marketing isn't always at the top table in B2B. Not always is marketing perceived as on the same level as sales sometimes. So it's great to see any opportunities that brings marketing work to the fore. I don't know if you've got any take on that, whether you agree, or what's your thought on it?
Yeah, I've not really considered it that way, but I guess naturally that would happen because I mean, especially working in a company like Siemens, it's all about network, and there's lots of different groups of people, and that's the real beauty and real joy of working for a company like Siemens is you meet so many diverse people. And again, it's that thing about spotting things and going, that'd be an interesting topic. And then you reach out to colleagues and you meet new colleagues and then new conversations, and they're aware of the podcast and stuff. So I think there is something to what you're saying, because the more what we're doing, what I've talked about a lot is external, but it equally is internal, because they'll maybe say, oh, Sensei do this great podcast and we're on it, and then they taught some, so it's that effect can certainly happen internally and help to grow the podcast, and both you personally as well, professionally, let's say.
And I'm picking up on that repurposing thing again as well. Like, do you ever take the content? I know we're going to talk about like your LinkedIn ads in a sec, actually, and how you use that to drive viewers for the podcast. But for once you've done a podcast, you've got the snippets and the clips out of that podcast. Do you ever encourage like other employees internally to share it on their own socials too, outside of the person that's attended the podcast? And I love that, by the way, encouraging guests to share it. Great way of extending reach of it. But yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we might have talked about this the other day, but the other thing that's changing with social as well, and it's happening in my feed as well, I see very few company pages anymore. And when before the acquisition again, I mean, we used to post to our company page, and we were growing followers and stuff, and it was a great way to do it. But if we were still in the same situation today, I'm not sure that would still be the most effective way to do it. And what that leads me to is actually the most effective way is to build, create, I guess, individual spokespeople. And there's a few ways to do that, but Siemens actually uses a really great tool I haven't heard of before, but basically allows employees to log into a platform. There's lots of different types of content in there, and they can connect their social account and then share it with their network. And we've just done that, and we've done that with Sensei. So with these clips and everything and the social posts, every week or whatever, we'll just upload them to this platform, and then colleagues will just share it out with their network through a few clicks of the button as well. So again, kudos to Siemens for such great like employee advocacy tool. Just a great tool for getting out the content. It's another avenue that sort of really helped to extend the reach, I'm sure of it as well.
Yeah, it just kind of builds that whole flywheel. So yeah, we didn't touch on it when we last spoke, actually, Now. So it's really, really interesting that you're bringing this into employee advocacy too, because one of the challenges of getting an employee advocacy program like singing is having a good quality and a quantity and level of quality of the content, of which you're both addressing through that podcast, repurposing that into clips, which is just like manna from heaven for employees that do want to share stuff on social but don't know what to share. And they've got like a constant stream of content for them to share as a result of this podcast and the advocacy tool that you're using. So really like that as a model. So let's pivot somewhat, because we touched on this right at the intro. I want to dig into this because it links to this podcast thing, because it all sounds well and good, great. As content creators, love the idea of the freedom of creating content, building a podcast, building this wonderful content, having great conversations. At some point, that's got to mean something for the business. So, podcast is not, this is not a direct response channel. This is no quick win. But I'm curious how you've got the freedom to leverage this podcast and build it to where it's got to. How you've demonstrated success, how you've got people bought into that journey, how you mentioned about like the mindset around metrics. So lots of questions in there, but wonder if you can unpack some of that for us, Niall.
Yeah, and it all sort of links together. I know I keep referring to before the acquisition as well, but in a way, the journey sort of starts there, where when I was sort of promoted to a more sort of senior marketing position, I always have to say the caveat is I'm not saying that just to big myself up. It's just what happened. It's just what led to a change. So at that point, the business, obviously the bit, great product, great business, really growing really well. But what I noticed was some fun, and actually, because I was obviously working there still, so I could see some fundamental flaws in terms of some of the things we were doing from a marketing perspective in a way, because we had a small sales team, and we were doing this high volume MQL model and passing it to sales, and they were saying, and we were patting ourselves on the back going, we're doing brilliantly, and they were saying, well, they just don't want to talk to us generally, or if they do, they have to sift through all these leads to find them. And the problem is the sales team at the time, we were also account managers for customers. They were doing new business, they were doing account management. It's a lot to do. So you can't, so for that, to ask them to also, go through these high volumes of people who generally probably aren't ready to buy and don't want to talk to them, was very ineffective. So the one thing I did, as well as bringing this more content-led demand generation, I'll call it strategy as well, is with that comes sort of a change in metrics. So what I was really interested in is no longer did person X download a true cost of downtime report, and they're from a company that's interesting to us, so I'll pass them to sales. It's actually it's literally the people who say, I want to buy your product, I want to speak to a salesperson. And so that means our sales team could focus their time on the people who actually want to speak to them, and then focus the rest of their time on expanding existing accounts, which is obviously an important part of it as well. So so that was one of the first things I did, is actually we need to look at metrics in a slightly different way. And and of course you have to, there's a bit of education around that, because you're going from hundreds of MQLs a month to, if you want to call them MQLs still, but to like, I don't know, 10 or 15 a month. But it's all about quality and people, people really engaged, really educated, and people ready to buy. And that's where the content strategy with the podcast comes to the fore, because that's what we're doing. We're generating a demand for our products. So hopefully over time, when people are ready to buy, they think of Siemens at the time, Sensei, but now think of Siemens when they're looking for predictive maintenance, and they add them as a potential option to their, because, I don't think anyone could say will be the only option on people's list, because if you're spending, six-figure amounts or whatever it might be, you're not going to just have one vendor on your list naturally, but we want to be on that list, and that's where we want to position ourselves. So again, it's this thing I present internally quite a lot. It's this 90%, 10% split, or sometimes it's a 95%, 5% split, where only a tiny proportion of people are ready to buy, whereas the majority of the market aren't in a position to buy or aren't ready to buy. And so it's that shift. We want to focus on the people who aren't ready to buy, but when they are, with content, we want to be able to position ourselves as one of the choices, or the top choice maybe, for that. And that's sort of the journey we've gone on, and it's sort of gone on again, I guess, within Siemens as well, as we sort of doing that too. But that's the general idea. It's about, even though Siemens has obviously much more bigger resources, but you still want to focus time in the right area, no matter how big, whether you're big or whether you're small, you still want to focus in the right areas. And that's what the strategy is really about from a sales, let's say, point of view. But it also gives the freedom to the marketing team as well to be, really creative, really, feel like you're impacting revenue, rather than what I said earlier, where you can become a bit like a sales assistant, sometimes doing admin, uploading lists, whatever. You can sort of move away from that and actually create marketing. And as long as it's measured like in the right way, then you can actually see and feel the impact of it in the organization, with the revenue numbers and things like that.
So I'm really curious to push on this a bit more. So, and think about some of these metrics, because that's a very meaningful shift to go away from, marketing being KPI'd on MQLs and maybe 100 or so per month, to then shifting that to say, what, we're only going to focus on truly qualified leads. They could be SQLs or whatever you want to call them, but basically at a much higher intent level. So we're going to see close rates go up, and that's great. But what we're going to see is overall volumes go down. So our KPI reports suddenly don't look as rosy, right? The top level numbers don't. So that's a brave and bold move. So naturally, there's going to have to be some counter to that, because I expect there will be some metrics that then you'll count to try and understand the impact of your demand gen efforts, whether it's reach, whether it's impressions, whether it's share of voice. So what are those metrics? And I'm sure lots of people would love to know those conversations that you had with leadership to shift that mindset.
Well, I guess first of all, I should say a lot of it comes down to sort of trust and belief in me, in me personally, I guess. So you have, so that's one thing. You can't do it without someone who believes in marketing, who believes in you personally, in your vision. And I've been very lucky actually throughout my career to have that with the bosses I've had, including I'll say my current one as well, who was, same as before the acquisition, same now, is that they've sort of backed this approach. It did take some education because, like you said, we're reducing what we term as MQLs, to a much smaller number. But the way I sold it is actually, and I wish I could, share it to the audience on the screen, because it's similar to this 90. It's another funnel sort of thing I show, but it's the idea that with a lead generation approach, only you might have more leads at the top of the funnel, but when you come to opportunities, it's much less actually winning. But if you focus on a smaller number of leads at the top of the funnel, which are high intent, ready to buy, then you'll get more opportunities and they'll win. So that'd be the first metric to look at. Instead of high volume of leads, it's how many of those high intent leads convert to opportunities. So that's the first one. Mm-hmm. And then how they convert to revenue. But then you also should be looking at, especially if you're with marketing a product like I am, which is a long sales cycle, it's actually what's the impact along, for the business metrics along the pipeline. So how is it affecting sort of sales velocity metrics? How fast is stuff moving through pipeline? What's the cost to acquire a customer? What's the customer retention rate? Which these metrics aren't all a marketing metric, because it's a team thing. It's customer success, it's sales, it's very delivery people. It's very much a team game. But marketing can have an effect on that, or does have an effect on that. But those are the kind of things you need to present as well. Like you said, at that level as well, because it's easy to share. We've got this many people listening to the podcast and stuff, but I think you just got to know your audience, who you're presenting to. I'd consider those metrics great for the team, because we can talk together and go, how can we move the needle on things like the podcast, or how many visits to the website, or SEO. But with the overall goal is we want to shift the metrics for, all those metrics I just talked about before. That's what we really want to shift. But you don't want to present this many website visits, this many podcast listens to management, because it's like, well, I don't care about that. I care about the bottom line, which is absolutely fair enough. And that's why, like I said, even saying we've done this many MQLs isn't really enough anymore. We've got, as marketing, we've got to go further than that and show our true worth, as it were.
Amen to that. I love that. Really, really good take. I didn't know you're going to go right into like sales velocity metrics and that kind of stuff. So I'm absolutely delighted to hear that. And that really does like underline your point about marketing's impact on sales and revenues. And I think there's a lot that us as marketers can do to kind of level up those conversations, I think, at a leadership level to speak the language of money, which is great. And I think the point that you mentioned is like, we're looking at kind of correlatory metrics that justify or prove marketing's impact of it. So, whilst one single podcast, we're not trying to attribute or even bother going there and like, yeah, great, I had 3,000 listens or 90,000 listens, fine, whatever. But ultimately, as your kind of engine continues to gather momentum, you're looking at the correlatory metrics like over time. And I guess you're having to look at metrics over a longer context window as well, I'm presuming, where you couldn't look at this over a week. You can't see how, well, you tell me if I'm wrong, actually. I can't imagine you'd see how like sales velocity is shifted in a week. You might be looking at a longer time period when you're looking at those kind of metrics, maybe quarterly. I don't know. Give us a sense of that, Niall.
Yeah, and I guess it ultimately depends on how long sort of sales cycles are. Is Usually quarterly is usually, or monthly is usually appropriate for most businesses. But another thing as well, so all the metrics I talked about there are usually calculated in CRMs or with the help of your CFO or finance director. But there's other forms of feedback you can add into the mix as well, and this is something I do as well, is actually both by interviewing customers and prospects, because they can tell you exactly how they buy, what channels they use, and that can help to justify an approach. But with the podcast as an example, I get feedback all the time from colleagues saying, "Oh, I was speaking to this prospect the other day, and he said he's been listening to the podcast, and that's what led them to come here." And there was a customer who I invited on the podcast, and I was like, "Do you know the format? I could send you some episodes." He was like, "Oh no, I always listen to the podcast. I already know the format." And that's what you don't get from metrics. You like said, 3,000 people listen to your podcast doesn't mean anything, but a customer saying it and a prospect saying it, and in our world as well. So I have people internally saying, "Oh, I listen." I think there was someone in one of my Norwegian colleagues, because I sent him a link to the podcast. "Oh, I'm already aware of the podcast. I listen to it in the car every day on the way to work," he said. I think. And if you don't ask people, and again, this is why you should ask people and dive into stuff and talk to customers, because you get these amazing insights, which sometimes the numbers don't say, but other times it can sort of back up what you're saying on one side, especially when we talk about that piece where marketing's beyond just leads and even opportunities. It's something much more powerful than that. And so that I use that kind of thing to sort of help illustrate that story or tell that story.
That's amazing. Like your qualitative and quantitative metrics come together, and the point that you mentioned, the point you just said, their story, and that's all data reporting is. It's a story, right? And it's how we tell that story that gets people bought into it, and that story is told by bringing it to life with more impactful metrics like the correlatory, like sales velocity and stuff that you're talking about, but also the human voice through that too. And it, like I said when we first spoke, the fact that you referenced talking to customers as an important part of your job took me by surprise, because I speak to so few marketers that actually speak to customers, which still boggles my mind, if I'm honest. So I don't know if you got any extra takes, any suggestions for the marketers to kind of get out from behind the spreadsheets and and have a chat with people.
Yeah. It's so important. I can't emphasize how important it is, because I'm not an expert. I never even, until I started at Sensei, I've never been to a manufacturing plant, but before. So unless you actually see it in the flesh and see and actually understand, how can we create marketing materials or content which resonates, both in terms of a marketing perspective, what channels to use and all that kind of thing, but also what really their day-to-day, what's their day-to-day like, what challenges they really have to face. But I guess the easiest route for customers, it's really, and it's a bit of a cliche, I guess, in B2B marketing as well, but that relationship with sort of sales or your business development team is very important. And sometimes I guess you might get pushback saying, it's a bit suspicious. Like, no, we don't want to do a case study. It's too soon, or don't want to do that. But it's not a case study at all. It's just a chat. It's more of a general chat, just to get in the mind of our customers, just so we can understand exactly where they're coming from. And most people are sort of open to it as well. It's not like I think maybe they think customers are busy, and sometimes they are, and that's fair enough. But there are customers, and especially I guess your more sort of successful ones, who are really happy to speak to you and help out and support in any way you can, because in our world, and many other companies, it's really a collaboration, not vendor customer, which it technically is, but in reality it's more the two teams are sort of overlapping in terms of working together, which is how it should be. So what that means is that should give you opportunities to be able to confidently say, "Oh, Mr. Customer, see the project's going really well, and it's really great, but I'd love to understand a bit more about these things. Can I have a quick 30-minute chat with you?" And like I said, from my experience, many customers are open to that, and I'm really grateful for them to give their time for that, because it's one thing being able to justify things, but it's just for my own understanding, to feel what they feel, even to some degree. So customer success teams, just build relationships with them. And one way you can do that, linking it back to the podcast, is invite them on the podcast, build a rapport, talk like this, do a few episodes, and then if there is if you want to build a little bit of a relationship first, that's the best way to do it. And then it's easy just to approach people and say, can you help me out with this? And obviously people will be willing to do that. But yeah, very, very important to do, people, marketers out there. Please talk to customers. There's one thing to take away. Please talk to your customers, understand what they're doing, invite them on your podcast, another way to do it. But very, very important.
I love that. I think that is a wonderful way to kind of wrap up our show today, actually, Niall. So before we wrap up, though, is there any other points and suggestions you might have for other B2B marketers before we close out?
Yeah. So I think the one thing you need to do is to really build out your network and just gain an understanding of what's happening outside of your organization and in the B2B marketing space. And the place I'd recommend, it will be very unsurprising, is LinkedIn particularly. And I could recommend a lot of people to follow, but there's some really fantastic voices out there and this is the only way I learned about it, is by listening to other people, listening to podcasts, really engrossing myself in the B2B marketing community. And then that gave me the confidence, what you said about presenting internally and changing minds internally, that gave me the confidence to go back internally and present to management. And so I'm saying that I believe this is the case because of this, because I'm listening, not only am I talking to customers, but I'm listening to what's happening in the market. So I'd start getting active on LinkedIn, both by following, but also participate. You'll have a view as well. And I think it's important to share your views so you get feedback. I mean, we wouldn't be doing this today if I wasn't posting comments and being part of that community. So it can open so many sort of doors. And I don't mean just career-wise, but just, which it can, but also just, connections with people. And so I have another connection with you now, Andy. I'm sure we'll follow each other and comment on each other's posts and things like that. I've got other, and I've only really started posting more regularly in the past few months on LinkedIn, and it's opened different doors, and I've met so many different people and learned so much from doing that. So yeah, that was a long way of saying just engross yourself in the B2B marketing space and be a participant, not a listener. You maybe could start being a listener and watch posts and like posts and consume content that way. But I'd also recommend just getting involved and commenting and posting yourself and put some of your thoughts out there. It's scary, but it's your view is as useful as anyone else's view, because you've got your experience, right? So that's the way I look at it. It's like I call it an online diary for me. So that's how I choose. And then it becomes less, I'm not selling anything either. I'm just sharing my experience. So that's what I would do.
Niall, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for your generosity in what you shared today. Thank you so much for watching or listening. And we'll be back next time with some more B2B leaders sharing more of their expertise around how they build brands and how they drive growth through content and community. Be sure to click like and subscribe to help this podcast grow, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.